Well, welcome. My name is Isaiah. I'm one of the pastors here, and I want to begin by saying, open up your Bibles to Colossians chapter 1. We're going to continue in our series today, and I don't know about you. I wanted to begin with this. I don't know about you, but I've always loved the first day of school. Even in college, I remember always being so excited and eager to begin a new semester. And then once that semester got on its way, I remember immediately feeling not so eager, more like, misery and despair. But I remember in 2004, I was in seminary and I took a class with a professor who I would probably describe as intense looking. And not the kind of professor that's going to give you hugs on the way in. Do you know what I'm talking about? I remember feeling so afraid, coming into the classroom, kind of hugging the wall, slowly unzipping my backpack. And, I didn't want to disrupt any of the deafening silence in the room. And I immediately wondered, why am I taking this class? What did I get myself into? And, as we went through the syllabus, which is always the worst, by the way, unpacking a 15-page document, reading it line by line, always the worst. I hate it still to this day. But this particular class was different. At the end of the syllabus, this professor had a prayer typed out in the back of the syllabus for us. And he said this prayer, he said about this prayer that he was going to pray this over us every class. And I thought, that's kind of strange. Seems like it would be kind of dry and dull and boring to just pray this same prayer over and over every class. But can I tell you something? The reality is that the more we walked through that semester, the more I looked forward to hearing that prayer. The more I looked forward to him praying it over us. And it started to have this deeper meaning for me. And the more he prayed, the more I began to see God produce some of those things that he was praying. But here's why I think it meant so much to me. The professor thought enough of our class and the importance of our time together that he wanted every word to count. He didn't want to just enter the class time based on how he felt in the moment. Like, let's say he didn't have his coffee that morning, or maybe he hit a lot of traffic that day, or maybe his kids were extra. You know what I'm talking about? He didn't want his feelings. He didn't want his day or his circumstances to affect how he felt, his attitude, or anything like that, because he wanted to pray specific things for us. And he believed in enough in the power of what he was saying to us and praying over us, because he thought it matters what I pray. There's a significance in the words that I choose, the words that I wrote down for this class. It matters because I believe that God is going to honor it. And I believe God is going to fulfill those requests. And as I thought about this time and this professor and his prayer, I was drawn to the parallels that we find with the Apostle Paul. I mean, the Apostle Paul, when we read his letters, he wrote down his letters. He wrote down his prayers for us, for the church at the time. And we get to read his prayers out loud. We get to spend some time today unpacking one of those prayers. And so as you turn to Colossians chapter 1, verse 9, I'm going to read the whole passage today, and then I'm going to unpack it a little bit. So let's do that. Verse 9, for this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience, and giving joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Okay, so there are a lot of things happening here. And I want to spend some time unpacking this for us today because we need to get this. Like we need to hear it. We need to read it. We need to believe it, and we need to receive what he is praying for this church today, but also for us. So look at verse 9. He says, "For this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you." Who's we? Him and Timothy. For what reason? What's the reason? Well, because they have faith. He knows that they are followers of Jesus, and he knows that there's going to be struggle, that there's going to be difficulty. There's going to be times in their lives where they're going to need help, a supernatural help. It's not going to be something they can do on their own. And so he says that's why we haven't stopped praying. Because there's power in a repeated prayer. And that might sound strange to you, but there is. There's power in this repetition over a situation or over a person's life. And with that in mind, as we move deeper into 2021, there are a lot of days ahead of us still. There are 341 days to be exact that are left in 2021. But let me ask you this. What would happen if you wrote down what you wanted God to do in your life? What if you wrote down your prayer that you wanted God to honor over your life, over your family's life, your marriage, your children, your roommates, your friends, your neighbors, your city? What would happen if you wrote down these things and believed and yearned and longed for God's powerful Spirit to break through in your life and all those around you? I believe powerful things would happen. There would be renewal, there would be transformation, there would be change. And that change may not affect any of your circumstances, but it will affect you. See, if you would say, God, here is what I believe that you're going to do in my life. Here is what I believe you want in my marriage. Like, this is the things that I think you want me to change. That I believe that you want from me as a father, as a mother, as a son, as a daughter, as a friend. And I'm not going to stop praying until I see you do it. I'm not going to stop. What would happen? Powerful things. See, I believe that the way you pray over your life will determine who you are at the end of this year. See, let me rephrase that. The words that you pray over your life will have significant life-changing effects. And again, it may not change your circumstance, but it will change you. And Paul wants us to understand this. He's writing out his prayer because he believes that God will produce specific things in our lives. And he's intent on not giving up, not ceasing, not stop petitioning on our behalf, on this church's behalf, until he sees these things produced in their life. So I want you to do something today. I want you to write out what you want God to do in your life this year. And if you don't have something specific right now, maybe we need to adapt or adopt this prayer for us. So in verse 9, it says this: "For this reason, since the day we heard about you," we've already read this, "we've not stopped praying for you." Okay? "We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives." See, Paul's prayer is that God would fill these people with the knowledge of his will. Now, maybe there's been times where in your life, depending on your circumstance, and you've prayed for God's will. Like, and generally, I think our prayers are for God's will are usually about me, about us. Like, God, I'm not sure if you want me to take this job opportunity. God, I'm not sure if I should still be in this relationship. God, I'm not sure, I want you to lead me and guide me because I don't know what you want me to do right now in this situation. It's very me-oriented. And our prayers about God God's will are almost always based on mostly me or mostly you. And I think what Paul is getting at, though, is his prayer goes way beyond what is happening in our personal lives. He's talking about something that transcends what's going on with them personally and goes much bigger than that. It's about not being so narrow-minded, not being so isolated, but to begin to broaden our scope, to realize that God's will is much larger than some of our specific things. And Paul prays that God would fill them with the knowledge of his will through all wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives to them. Wisdom and understanding that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit, would give to them. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think you're smart? Well, let me rephrase that. Let me ask the person next to you. Does that person think they are smart? Yeah, probably. What about, do you think they're wise? And really, what's the difference? See, being intelligent is certainly a valuable thing. You can know a lot about things. I'm sure in your expertise, you're probably pretty well known, you know a lot of things and you're pretty well versed in your field of expertise. But I like what Shelley Warren says and how she puts this. She says wisdom, and especially spiritual wisdom, is not just knowing what's good for you, but applying that knowledge into your everyday life. See, in other words, spiritual wisdom is the ability to discern truth and the ability to make good decisions based on that truth. And Paul is praying that you would be filled with that kind of knowledge. Like not just knowledge about things, but knowledge that is able to help you discern and make the right choices and decisions. Now, I think many of you probably can attest to knowing between right and wrong. But I'm almost certain you could also attest to knowing between right and wrong and still choosing wrong, right? So for example, recently I was spending time sharing some stories with our student ministry. And I shared some stories that I don't really care to repeat because they make me seem really foolish. Why? Well, because I made some really poor choices that not only affected my life, but affected others around me. And if you asked me then if I knew what was right, or at least between right and wrong, I would have told you generally, yes, I think I did know between right and wrong. But in that moment of peer pressure, in that moment of wanting to be liked by my friends, in that kind of pressure situation, did I make the right choices? No. And maybe you're like me. You can attest to making some decisions in your life where you knew the right decision to make, but you chose otherwise. And see, Paul says, I'm never going to stop praying. I'm never going to stop praying and asking God to fill these people with his knowledge, with spiritual wisdom, a wisdom that's beyond them, and an understanding that's beyond their understanding. Why? Well, because of verse 10. Verse 10 says, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way. When you are filled with that kind of knowledge, like spiritual wisdom, spiritual understanding, it will produce what Paul is praying, a life, and that brings us to our first point, a life of worth. See, Paul goes on to walk them through what happens when his knowledge of his will is placed inside of them, and understanding of truth and the ability to make decisions about the truth is placed in a person's life. It affords them the kind of ability to live a life of worth. Now, I want you to hear me out. This has nothing to do with your status or your position in Christ. It has nothing to do with how long you've been a Christian or how long you've been going to church or how many prayer meetings or Bible studies you've done. Paul's prayer is that in everything that we do, in everything that we say, in every way that we think and act, that it would align more closely with who we really are. And that is someone who is following closely to God, praying, asking, yearning for God's will, his wisdom, and spiritual understanding to be in us. See, Paul's concern isn't that you know the words and know them like factual knowledge. He wants that word to be in us. He wants our relationship to be close so that the words of Jesus would be inside of us. And he's praying this kind of stuff into existence. Like, it's gonna happen. I believe it. I know it. There will be struggle. It might not change your circumstance, but it will happen. And that's the kind of yearning and longing and commitment that he has in this prayer. So Paul is saying that if you want your life to be a life of worth, if you want it to be pleasing to God, you have to pray for it. You have to ask God to do it. Why? Because you can't do it on your own. So when you live a life of worth, Paul says the outcome is verse 10, bearing fruit in every good work. See, when you are filled with the knowledge of God's will, it will produce what Paul prays. Number 2, a fruitful life. Now, bearing fruit is kind of an interesting phrase because I don't know how many of you grew up on an orchard. I mean, I didn't. But I'd be willing to guess that most of us also have never actually planted a fruit tree and eaten of that fruit tree. Now, it's more likely that you probably moved in and there was already a fruit tree in that backyard and it just kept producing fruit and you just enjoyed it, right? But maybe some of you have. Maybe you planted that delicious Myers lemon tree, which if you have, let me know because I love them. And you cared for it and you nurtured it and you gave it water and sunlight and it started to produce some fruit, some delicious lemons. But what about that orange tree? What about that avocado tree? What about that peach tree or the apricots or nectarines? Are you bearing fruit in those trees? See, Paul is praying that we not only bear fruit in one area, but in every area of our life. See, he's praying that we bear fruit in every situation, in our relationships at home, in our coworkers, in our friendships, in our jobs, in our neighborhoods, in our city, in the way that we volunteer, in our churches, in our specific gifts and our talents, bearing fruit everywhere so that people will look around and see there's goodness there. There's goodness in my marriage. There's goodness in my relationship, in my job, in my home, in my church. There's goodness in all those things, bearing fruit in all of those. And Paul's prayer for this church was that everywhere people look, every aspect of their life would be pleasing to God, and that not only would it be good, but that it would bless other people. Like that is the fruit, to bless others, not to just have it for ourselves. The prayer is to bear fruit everywhere and in everything with everyone, and this isn't something that you can just do on your own. So Paul's praying, let this come about as you're filled with the knowledge and the wisdom and the spiritual knowledge of God. As his will is produced in you, it would bear this fruit. And Paul goes on, not only that it would create a life of worth, not only that it would bear fruit in every way, but that you would grow in the knowledge of God. See, when you are filled with the knowledge of God and his will, it will produce what Paul prays. Number 3, a life that continues to grow. See, that word grow means to continually grow. It means to always move forward. That type of growth. It's growing and growing towards creating a greater and larger capacity for growth. See, many of us, I think, have experienced physical growth, right? We understand as a kid, even in our adolescence, especially in our adolescence, we're constantly changing and transforming during our teenage years. And it's really easy to observe that kind of growth. You start to grow in height. You start to change physically. So, for example, I have a picture of my 14-year-old self and my 18-year-old self. As you can see, lots of things changed in just 4 years. I mean, even as you compare me, lots of things change. I mean, some things are getting a little bit older for sure. They're certainly not growing with vibrancy, but things change and you can see and observe physical change. But the real question is, what's changing on the inside? What's growing in there? Because at some point, it will stop physically. But inside, internally, in here, and in here, what's growing inside of there? What's growing with greater and greater capacity of understanding and knowledge and wisdom of God? What's being produced inside of here? That's what really matters. My kids, they know a lot about me. They know a lot of information. I've shared lots of stories. And they can give you a lot of facts about me, but the truth is, does that matter? Does any of that information matter compared to the closeness and relationship that I have with them? Does any of that matter compared to the experiences that I spent of spending time with me, of knowing the real me, my heart, my hopes, my aspirations, my dreams, my desire for them in regards to the relationship with God? No, it doesn't. It doesn't even compare. It doesn't even come close. And that's the kind of knowledge that Paul is praying for. Not the kind of growth out here, but the kind of growth in here and in here. And I love that this is his prayer because he doesn't assume that growth will happen. It doesn't happen by accident. But I think that's the way that some of us are living. We believe that we just assume it's gonna happen. And the truth is, if we're not asking God to help us grow in our knowledge of him, then we are hoping that it just happens by accident. Growth doesn't happen that way. Not inside, not spiritual growth. It happens with intentionality. It happens with drawing closer and closer to him, asking him, yearning and longing and begging for him to produce certain things in your life. Not out here, but inside. So when you are filled with the knowledge of God's will, it will produce what Paul prays. Number 4, a life of spiritual power. In verse 11, he prays this: being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience. So I'm not going to expand on this thought too much, other than to say everyone is going to experience pain in this life. Everyone is going to experience heartache and sadness and troubles. It's not an if, it's really when. And in our humanity, we grasp for all the strength that we can possibly muster, and we quickly realize that we don't have what it takes to make it through life's most difficult situations on our own. We don't have the strength. We don't have the ability. We don't have the power to overcome this world, but God does. God does have that power. And Paul isn't praying for these people to just drum up enough strength on their own to just, I'm going to will it into existence. No, he prays for spiritual power. He prays for power that only God can provide. And that's the kind of power that you need to overcome some of life's most painful and unimaginable situations. And it's by the power of the Holy Spirit that your life lived out on display preaches better than any sermon ever could. And here's the final point. I'm going to end with this. When you are filled with the knowledge of God's will, it will produce what Paul prays, a life of thanksgiving. Verse 12, it says this: and giving joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son that he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Paul is calling for a thankfulness that is very, very particular. He's saying, do not let them forget that you're the one, God, that you're the one that has qualified them, that you're the one who has counted them worthy to receive what they're really not worthy of receiving. You're the one who did that. And Paul wants these people to understand that thankfulness should well up inside of them. It should be birthed again in their hearts every time they think about how God has qualified them to share in an inheritance that God has blessed them with his holy people in his kingdom. They didn't do anything. They just received, and out of an abundance of love, a love there's no way that we could ever wrap our minds around, God chose to rescue them from darkness. See, Paul is saying, don't forget. Please don't forget where you came from. Don't forget how hopeless that it was, how dark it was. Don't forget how dead your heart was until God breathed life into you. See, Paul says every time that it comes into your mind and you remember what God has rescued you from, may thankfulness, gratitude, God, thank you. May that well up inside of you. And I want you to know that this is the good news. Paul's saying, this is what I want you to understand. This is what I want to pray into existence for you. That heart of gratitude would be something that you carry everywhere you go. It's a prayer for Paul that says he will never stop praying for this church. But you see, this prayer wasn't just for the church in Colossae. It was a prayer and is a prayer for you and for me. It's a prayer that I'm asking us to join with Paul and pray into existence, into our lives. I don't want us to skip past this. I want us to really be focused, to really truly cling to this prayer for our year. This time is for you and it's for me, and it's for us to acknowledge that we need to cling to something this year. We need to cling to some words. We need to cling to some promises, to some hope this year. And I want this prayer to be the thing, the source that we hold on to, that we ask God's will to be done in our lives, that his knowledge would just permeate, that it would pour into us, that spiritual wisdom would be what guides us, and that we'd be able to speak some of these things into existence in our life. Paul's prayer for these people and for us today is to never lose sight of the awe that this was supposed to and intended to produce. His hope was that we would always think about what Jesus has done in our life and to be completely overwhelmed by his great love, completely overwhelmed by the fruit that it will produce in our lives, completely overwhelmed by the growth and the transformation that would occur, not just in your life, but in the lives around you. And it begins and it ends with this prayer.